Ashes of Thornewood, written by S.K.J. Chapter 2. The road to the thorn plantation seemed endless, stretching out before us as the landscape shifted from dense woods to vast open fields. The carriage wheels rumbled steadily beneath us, and I leaned forward, eager to catch a glimpse of the grand estate Sebastian had described so vividly. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over everything, but as we drew closer, the warmth of the light did little to dispel the unease creeping into my chest. In the distance, I noticed movement. Figures working in the fields, their backs bent under the weight of labor. The faint sound of a whip cracking echoed in the still air, sending a chill down my spine. My stomach tightened as I realized these were not hired hands, as I had naively assumed, but slaves. A cold knot formed in my stomach, and I glanced at Sebastian, hoping for some reassurance, but he stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Sebastian. I began hesitantly, my voice barely above a whisper. I thought, "You said you didn't agree with slavery." For a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves on the packed dirt road. The earthy scent of the fields mingled with the faint smell of sweat and tobacco that lingered in the air. Finally, he turned to me, his green eyes clouded with frustration and something darker. Guilt, perhaps, or resignation. "It's not as simple as that, Evie," he said softly. "This is my mother's estate. She's set in her ways, and besides, who else would tend the fields?" His words hit me like a slap. I recoiled slightly, biting my lip to keep from saying something I might regret. I felt foolish, like a child who had misunderstood the rules of a dangerous game. The sight of those men and women toiling under the hot sun left a sour taste in my mouth. When he spoke to my father, Sebastian had seemed so confident in his beliefs, as if he were ready to take up arms for the cause. But now, faced with the harsh reality, I felt betrayed. Of course, it was his mother's farm, but still, I had thought. The carriage slowed as we approached the grand entrance of the plantation house. It was just as Sebastian had described, imposing and elegant, with white columns rising up to meet a roof of dark slate. The gravel crunched beneath the wheels as the carriage came to a halt. The air was thick with the scent of magnolias and damp earth, but there was a heaviness in the atmosphere, a sense of foreboding that settled over me like a shroud. The door to the carriage swung open, and I took Sebastian's hand as he helped me down. My feet touched the gravel of the drive, and I found myself staring up at the massive structure before me, feeling small and out of place. A thin, rigid woman emerged from the front door, her gaze sharp as it settled on me. Her dark hair was pulled into a severe bun, and her green eyes, so much like Sebastian's, were hard and unyielding, as if they could slice through steel. Every feature of her face, from the rigid set of her jaw to the thin line of her lips, spoke of a life-spent in command. "Evangeline," she said, her voice clipped and cold. She didn't smile, didn't offer any warmth, just stood there, her lips pressed into a tight line. "I am Mrs. Thorn. Welcome to Thornewood." Her words felt more like an obligation than a greeting. I offered her my best smile, though it faltered under her stern gaze. "Thank you, Mrs. Thorn. It's a pleasure to meet you." She didn't respond, only turned her attention to Sebastian. "Your rooms are prepared. The servants will assist Evangeline with her belongings." As if on cue, a young woman appeared behind Mrs. Thorn. She was around my age, perhaps a year or two older, with a quiet demeanor and eyes that never quite met mine. She wore a simple dress, the fabric worn and faded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "This is Sarah," Mrs. Thorn said dismissively. "She will see to your needs." I smiled at Sarah, trying to catch her eye, but she kept her gaze firmly on the ground, her fingers still fidgeting with the edge of her apron. "Thank you, Sarah," I said softly, hoping to convey some friendliness, some humanity, in a place that felt so devoid of it. Sarah nodded slightly but remained silent, her posture stiff. She took hold of my small trunk with surprising strength and began leading me toward the house. I hesitated, caught between following Sarah and returning to Sebastian's side. But when I looked back, he was already deep in conversation with his mother, irritation darkening his features. He purposefully avoided my gaze. I sighed and followed Sarah inside. As we entered the house, the cool air hit me, carrying with it the scent of polished wood and faint traces of incense. The interior was every bit as grand as the exterior. High ceilings, rich mahogany furniture, and intricate chandeliers that glimmered softly in the waning light. But there was a stillness, a kind of quiet that felt stifling rather than peaceful. I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls themselves were watching me, that the very air was thick with something unsaid. Sarah led me up a grand staircase, her small footsteps echoing in the vast space. As we reached the landing, she paused briefly, glancing at me as though she wanted to say something but wasn't sure if she should. I offered her an encouraging smile, trying to bridge the gap between us. "This way, miss," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She led me down a long hallway to a room at the far end. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint scent of lavender from somewhere down the hall. Sarah pushed open the door to reveal a beautifully appointed guest room, with a large four-poster bed draped in deep red curtains and a view of the sprawling estate beyond. It was elegant, just as Sebastian had described, but there was something missing, something warm, something that made it feel like home. "This will be your room until after the wedding, Miss Evangeline," Sarah said quietly, finally meeting my gaze. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of curiosity and caution, as if she were trying to figure out what to make of me. "Thank you, Sarah," I replied, setting my hand on her arm lightly. "You don't need to call me Evangeline. Evie is fine." Her eyes widened slightly, and she took a small step back, her expression unsure. "Yes, miss," she said, though I could tell she was still wary of me, as if I were a creature she had never encountered before. She busied herself with my trunk, avoiding further eye contact. "Do you like working here, Sarah?" I asked, hoping to ease the tension. Sarah hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded one of my dresses. It's work, miss. We do what we must." I nodded, sensing that I shouldn't press further. The awkwardness between us hung in the air, heavy and palpable. I tried to make conversation again, feeling the need to fill the silence. "It's a beautiful home. Mr. Thorn built it the early 1800s, Sarah replied, her voice more confident this time. "It's a bit much, though," I continued, running my hand over the wooden knobs of the bed frame, trying to keep the conversation light. Sarah offered a small, almost shy smile. "A bit." I reached out to help her unload the trunk, but she looked up quickly, her eyes wide with fear. "You don't need to help me, miss. If Mrs. Thorn sees you doing work that's meant to be mine, we'll both be in trouble." I withdrew my hand, feeling more out of place than ever. I wandered over to the window and pulled back the heavy curtains to look down on the grounds. The view was breathtaking. Endless fields stretching toward the horizon, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. But below, I could see Sebastian and his mother still standing in the courtyard. She looked cross, and Sebastian's brows were furrowed. "She doesn't seem to like me," I said, keeping my eyes on the two figures below. Sarah hesitated, glancing at the door as if afraid someone might overhear. "Miss, can I be frank?" she asked softly. "Of course, Sarah," I replied, turning to face her with a smile, trying to put her at ease. She chuckled nervously, hanging my dress on a hanger. "You're, well, a bit of a surprise for everyone here, miss. A lot of us weren't sure what to expect." Her large eyes scanned my appearance, and I brushed down my dress, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "Master Sebastian wrote of your arrival, but he didn't say much more than he had met a girl, and they were to be married. Mrs. Thorn was livid he didn't first consult with her. She doesn't know you, miss. She doesn't want a gold digger for a daughter-in-law." I felt my mouth drop open, stunned by Sarah's bluntness. "I apologize for my frankness, miss," she said quickly, bowing her head in regret. "No, Sarah. I appreciate your honesty. I'm just surprised to hear this." Sarah seemed to relax a little at my response. "I'd be careful around Mrs. Thorn. She's not a kind lady." Sarah finished unpacking and closed my trunk, sliding it under the bed. I sat there in silence, trying to absorb everything she had said. "Sarah," I began, but before I could continue, the door creaked open behind us, and Mrs. Thorn stepped into the room. "Evangeline, dinner will be served shortly," she announced, her tone leaving no room for conversation. Her eyes flicked to Sarah, cold and unyielding. "That will be all. Sarah, you may leave." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah murmured, ducking her head as she quickly exited the room, leaving me alone with Mrs. Thorn. "I trust you'll find everything to your liking," Mrs. Thorn said, her words clipped as she surveyed the room. "I expect you to join us promptly for dinner. I won't tolerate tardiness." "Of course, Mrs. Thorn," I replied, my voice steady despite the unease building inside me. Mrs. Thorn turned to leave, but paused at the doorway, glancing back at me with an almost imperceptible smirk. "And Evangeline," she added, her voice dripping with condescension, "do try to behave yourself. We wouldn't want our guests thinking you're feral." Her words stung, but before I could muster a response, she was gone, the door clicking shut behind her. I stood there for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts and shake off the heavy sense of foreboding that had settled over me since our arrival. I wandered around the room for a few moments, trying to distance myself from Mrs. Thorn's harsh words. The scent of lavender hung faintly in the air, mingling with the cool evening breeze that drifted in through the open window. I changed into a more formal dress for dinner, hoping to make a better impression. I took a deep breath, steadying myself as I left the guest room and made my way down the grand staircase. The dining room was just off the main hall, its large double doors already open, allowing the soft glow of candlelight to spill into the corridor. The light was inviting, but as I approached, that familiar heaviness returned, pressing down on me with every step. The dining room, like the rest of the house, was grand and elegant. The long, polished table was set with fine china and silverware that gleamed in the flickering candlelight. A massive chandelier hung overhead, its crystals casting small rainbows across the room. Despite the opulence, the atmosphere felt oppressive, as if the very air were weighed down by unspoken tension. Sebastian stood by the window, his back to me as he looked out into the fading twilight. Mrs. Thorn was already seated at the head of the table, her posture as rigid as ever, a glass of wine held delicately in her hand. She looked up as I entered, her eyes narrowing slightly as she assessed me, searching for any flaw. "Evangeline," she said coolly, motioning to the seat beside her. "Please sit." I smiled politely, though it felt like a fragile thing, and moved to take my place at the table. Sebastian turned at the sound of my name and gave me a small, encouraging smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Something was troubling him, and I had a sinking feeling I knew what it was. As I sat down, a servant entered the room carrying a tray with a soup tureen. He moved with quiet efficiency, placing the tureen on the table and stepping back, waiting for Mrs. Thorn's nod before beginning to serve. I watched him, noting the careful way he avoided making eye contact with any of us. "Thank you," I said softly as he filled my bowl. The words slipped out before I could think better of it, a reflexive politeness that felt natural to me. Mrs. Thorn's sharp intake of breath made me glance at her. Her eyes locked onto mine, cold and unyielding. "Evangeline," she said, her voice slicing through the air, "we do not address the servants. They understand their place." I bit back a retort, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. The servant gave no indication that he'd heard anything at all, his face a mask of neutrality as he continued to serve the soup. I forced a smile and nodded, though I couldn't shake the discomfort that settled over me like a blanket. The rest of the dinner passed in strained silence. The food was as fine as Sebastian had promised, rich, flavorful dishes that would have been a delight under different circumstances. But each bite felt heavy in my mouth, weighed down by the tension in the room. I glanced at Sebastian several times, hoping for some sign of reassurance, but he seemed distant, his focus split between his mother and the unease that I knew he must be feeling too. "Sebastian," I ventured, hoping to break the silence. "The house is truly beautiful. You were right in everything you described." He looked up, a small smile touching his lips. "I'm glad you think so, Evie." His eyes twinkled slightly, as if thankful for the silence to be broken. "Yes," Mrs. Thorn interjected, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Thornewood was built by my late husband. We take great pride in its upkeep." I nodded, feeling the weight of her gaze on me. "It's clear that a lot of care has gone into maintaining it," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Indeed," she replied, her tone clipped. "And we expect all who live here to respect that." The implication was clear, and I felt the sting of her words, but I kept my expression neutral. "Of course. It's only fitting you would have such high expectations. What is it you said her father does?" Mrs. Thorn asked Sebastian, her voice dripping with disdain. "Oh, he owns a local goods store," Sebastian replied, his tone careful. Mrs. Thorn scoffed. "A local goods store. Might as well stick peasant to her title." Sebastian opened his mouth to speak, but I couldn't hold back any longer. The heat in my cheeks rose as I cut in, my voice trembling with the effort to stay composed. "My father has been quite successful." She laughed, a cold, dismissive sound. "Of course, he has," she said, waving her hand as if swatting away a fly. "But only 2 daughters. How sad to see his family name die." This time, Sebastian did interject. "That's enough, Mother," he said, his voice darkening. Mrs. Thorn looked surprised. I hadn't told Sebastian about Benjamin. It hadn't come up in conversation, and I hadn't felt the need to share that part of my past. But in the heat of defending my father, I felt a monster grow inside me, and I said confidently, "He had a son first. But he's dead, so yes, you could say he only has 2 daughters. But last I checked, my sister and I have done quite fine for ourselves." Silence fell over the room. The servant standing in the corner smiled, but quickly wiped the smirk off his face. Sebastian locked eyes with me. "You never mentioned your brother," he said. "I didn't feel the need to," I replied, taking another bite of food, though regret stormed inside me. I instantly regretted saying anything. Mrs. Thorn pursed her lips, but no one spoke for a while, the only sound the clinking of silverware. The discomfort in the room grew unbearable when Mrs. Thorn corrected me yet again when I thanked another servant for refilling my glass of wine. This time, she didn't just chide me but went further, her voice dripping with disdain. "You must learn, Evangeline," she said, the corners of her mouth curling into a semblance of a smile, that it is unbecoming for a lady to concern herself with the staff. It's rather feral, don't you think? I froze, the insult hanging in the air between us like a sharp blade. It was the second time she had called me feral that night. My grip on the stem of my wineglass tightened, fury and hurt battling within me. I forced myself to remain calm, though inside, the word branded itself into my mind. Feral, as though I were some wild creature who didn't belong in her refined world. "Mother?" Sebastian said quietly, his voice strained. "That's enough." Mrs. Thorn raised an eyebrow, her gaze shifting to him with a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "I'm simply educating her, Sebastian. She has much to learn." "Evie is my fiancée," he replied, his tone controlled but firm. "And she will be treated with the respect she deserves." A tense silence fell over the room, and I could see the anger flickering in Mrs. Thorn's eyes, though she said nothing more. I swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. I had never felt so out of place, so unwelcome. The rest of the dinner passed in excruciating silence. I ate little, my appetite gone, and when the final course was served, I excused myself as politely as I could manage, the strain of the evening weighing heavily on my shoulders. Sebastian rose to follow me, but his mother placed a hand on his arm, holding him back. "Stay, Sebastian," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We have matters to discuss." I didn't wait to hear more. I made my way back up the grand staircase, my heart heavy and my mind spinning. The room I had been given felt more like a cage now, the elegant furnishings doing little to ease the turmoil inside me. I changed into my nightgown, the silence of the house pressing in on me from all sides. I climbed into the massive bed, the cold silk sheets offering little comfort as I pulled the covers around me. The ceiling above loomed dark and distant, a silent witness to my despair. The events of the evening replayed in my mind, each word from Mrs. Thorn cutting deeper than the last. My chest ached with the weight of it all, and despite my efforts to hold them back, tears slipped down my cheeks, hot and unwelcome. The house was quiet, but not entirely. As I lay there, I could hear the faint murmur of voices from downstairs, rising and falling in a pattern that told me Sebastian and his mother were arguing. Their words were too muffled to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. My heart twisted with guilt and sadness. Guilt that I had caused this tension between them, and sadness that I was already being pulled into a world where I didn't belong. Doubt gnawed at me. Would Sebastian still want me now that his mother had cast her cold, judgmental gaze upon me? Was the love we'd built over the summer strong enough to withstand her disdain? I buried my face in the pillow, trying to block out the sounds, but they only grew louder in my mind. The tears flowed freely now, soaking into the pillowcase as I cried myself to sleep, the reality of my situation sinking in with each passing moment. I had left home in search of a new life, but as I drifted into uneasy slumber, a chilling realization settled over me. This new life might hold chains far heavier than the ones I'd left behind, chains that could bind my heart as tightly as any iron bars.